Good morning, good afternoon, good evening in the different time zones represented in the audience attending this event. I'm David Myers, and I teach in the Department of History at UCLA. On behalf of the UCLA Leve Center for Jewish Studies and the Sady and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History, I'm delighted to welcome you to the first of two conversations about the role of the historian today, along with our co-sponsors, the Historical Society of Israel and the Association for Jewish Studies. I'd like to extend a special thanks to the wonderful staff at the Leve Center for Jewish Studies for all of its support in hosting today's event. I should tell you that this event is being recorded, and I also want to let you know that there will be a second event in this series that will take place next week, March 2nd, at the same time in the same time zones, and it will feature Orit Bashkin, David Engel, Yaron Harel, and Sholomit Folkov in a conversation in Hebrew moderated by Shmuel Feiner. These conversations seek to explore the task of the historian in an extraordinary moment in time. We are in the midst of intense biological, environmental, political, and social upheaval that sometimes seems like it's tottering on the brink of catastrophe. At a minimum, the historian can help us understand how we got where we are. But is there anything more to expect of the historian? Can historians, through their knowledge of the past, help chart a better future? Of course, we should remember, as Isaiah Berlin recalled, that historians are masters of retrodiction more than prediction. They're better at combing and chronicling the past than prophesying the future. But what place should historians play in the public domain? In the Israeli context, we know of historians from Ben-Zion Dinur to Shlomo Ben-Ami, who served as ministers of government. For Dinur, to be sure, the realms of the historical, educational, and ideological were deeply entwined with one another. In recent years in the United States, some prominent scholars have suggested that the White House should create a council of historical advisors to provide much-needed contextual perspective on policy decisions. So again, should the historian assume a public role at this moment? Is that the nature of the historian's task? Or is it otherwise? To piece together quietly and meticulously in the solitude of the study or the archive, a picture of the past without regard to public attention or relevance. And what is the distinctive task in this regard of Jewish history, if any? To help us think through these questions, we have a superb panel of historians whom I'll introduce in just a minute. But here's the order of events for today. We'll hear now briefly from representatives of our two main co-sponsors, Shmuel Feiner, who holds the Samuel Brown Chair in Jewish History at Bar-Ilan University and is chairman of the Historical Society of Israel, and Noam Pianko, who is the Samuel Stroum Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Washington and president of the Association for Jewish Studies. Following their words, I'll introduce the panelists and we'll jump right into a conversation. If we have time, we'll entertain questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Let me now turn to my friend and co-initiator of this series, Professor Shmuel Feiner.
Thank you, David. Shalom, dear colleagues, and welcome to this special event, an academic virtual meeting with speakers and audience from the United States and Israel. We're going to discuss this task of the Jewish historian today. In 1942, in the midst of the darkest moment in the history of the Jews in Europe, the Hebrew writer Chaim Azaz published his well-known and most troubling story, The Sermon, Hadrasha, and gave a voice to Yudke, the young kibbutznik who declared, "I'm opposed to Jewish history. I would simply forbid teaching our children Jewish history, while the devil teaches them about our ancestors' shame. I would just say to them, boys, from the day we were exiled from our land, we have been a people without a history. Class dismissed, go out and play football." So, and at the same time, in the 1940s, the writer Shmuel Yosef Agnon was walking just a few blocks from where I am talking today on his modern novel Shira, where he criticized and even mocked the historians of the young Hebrew University for being so irrelevant and boring. When dark clouds were threatening European Jewry and the situation in Palestine was very fragile, his protagonist, Manfred Herbst, was struggling with his unfinished study of the burial of the poor in the Byzantine Empire. Although the study of Jewish history made huge progress, we historians, 80 years later, are still haunted by those ideas and still asking ourselves if our work is meaningful. For whom do we toil? למי אנחנו עמלים? And what is our task? This is what stands behind this event. Following a long conversation over the years with my dear colleague David Myers, we thought that 2021 is a good time for a conversation on this important topic. How do we respond to the many new challenges? How should we write and teach in the age of the digital revolution, the so-called crisis of the humanities, the age of false news, post-truth, and alternative facts, the pandemic, which we still cannot comprehend its implications, the weakness of liberal democracies in Europe, America, and Israel, the political disputes over the definition of anti-Semitism, the emergence to the open of a Jewish ugly racism, the great division in Jewish and Israeli politics, and many others. Facing conspiracy theories, political attempts to limit the academic freedom and to control historical narratives and fundamentalist attacks of the academia, the mission of the historians who are committed to the critical study of the past is becoming more difficult and more crucial and meaningful for the future of our civilization. So I'm honored to represent here the expanding community of historians in my capacity of the chair of the Historical Society of Israel. While significantly transforming the way the past is considered and investigated, the community is proud to follow the footsteps of the founding fathers who established in Jerusalem 1924 the Ethnographical Society. The founder was Professor Ben-Zion Dinur, already mentioned by David, a Zionist activist, educator, historian, an Israeli politician who was born in the Russian Empire, and Professor Yitzhak Ber, a prominent historian and an expert on medieval Spanish Jewish history who was born in Germany. Exactly 70 years ago, following the establishment of the State of Israel, the society changed its name to the Historical Society of Israel. I'm very happy that we could meet today, scholars and students from America and Israel, and I appreciate very much the cooperation with Professor Myers and UCLA, and with the AJS and its president, Professor Noam Pianko. I would like to thank the team of the Historical Society of Israel, its director, Michal Sagi, and its coordinator, Dr. Tsela Rubal, who made this happen. I'm looking forward to this important conversation, and I would like already to invite you all to join the next conversation on the same topic, but in Hebrew, next Tuesday, same time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shmuel. And I should just say that there are likely people between Israel and North America who are also logging in, and we welcome them as well. I'd like now to turn things over to Professor Noam Pianko.
Thank you, David. I will be brief and just share my thanks and appreciation as the president of the Association for Jewish Studies, both to the Historical Society of Israel and to the UCLA Leve Center for putting this event together. The AJS is really enthusiastic about being part of this event. We are a learned society and a professional organization, and our mission is to advance research and teaching in Jewish studies, as well as foster greater understanding of Jewish studies scholarship among the wider public. So this sort of a conversation is precisely the type of thing that we really should be doing and do and would like to do more of. And it's a particular opportunity for over 1,900 members who are faculty, graduate students, independent scholars, and other professionals whose interests are connected to Jewish studies. In particular, I think, as has already been mentioned by Shmuel and David, this is a particularly important kind of a conversation to have, as so many of the areas of scholarship of members of the AJS, that we historically thought of as maybe arcane scholarly questions, or certainly things that were best left to the library, have now become the flashpoint of partisan politics in the United States and around the globe, whether it's anti-Semitism, Israel, American Jewish identity. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about as the president of AJS is how should a professional organization respond to the, I think, increasing pressure from our members and communities to be able to speak up on issues that have such important political relevance. Of course, the challenges within our organization, like within the broader population, there are so many different scholarly and political views on some of these questions. And because we have such a diverse community, once we get to a point when an issue happens or an event happens and on a hot button topic, there are often calls from different sides to advocate on a position. And my feeling is that what we have the opportunity to do in the organization is way before it gets to that point to actually create conversations like this where we can learn and listen to one another and disagree, agree, try to understand other perspectives in an open conversation with colleagues, so that once we do get to the inevitable event that will pop up when some of these questions have such political import, we have kind of the experience to fall back on of understanding the other side before we're sort of stuck in this polarized social media firestorm. So I'm really grateful to David and Shmuel for initiating this, and I'm really thrilled that AJS can be part of it.
Thank you very much, Noam, for your words and for the support of the AJS, and to you, Shmuel, and the Historical Society of Israel. And now to our panel. Let me introduce very briefly our panelists. Idelson-Shein is a senior lecturer in the Department of Jewish History at Ben-Gurion University. Her research focuses on Jewish history in early modern Europe. Mandel is the 18th president of Williams College and a professor of history, whose scholarship has focused on the history of Jews and others in France. Devin Naar is the Isaac Al-Hadif Professor in Sephardic Studies at the University of Washington, where he is now working on a new book entitled Reimagining the Sephardic Diaspora. And last, but certainly not least, Anita Shapira, who really needs no introduction, is the Reuben Marenfeld Professor Emerita at Tel Aviv University and one of the most prominent Jewish and Israeli historians today. Welcome to all of you, and let's jump right in. I'm going to start with you, Anita. We'll begin with a very personal biographical question. Even though I first met you in the fall of 1982 as a student in your seminar, I don't know that I know the answer to this question. So how and why did you become an historian? And if you could unmute yourself. You need to unmute yourself, Anita. The most common words uttered in the pandemic in all languages.
Okay. The truth is that I knew when I was 16 years old that I'm going to study history. Why? Because I love it. Not for any other reason, simply because I loved it. Whenever I read a novel, I always felt the historical background. And it's funny because nobody taught me that, nobody influenced me. It's just, it was there. Now, maybe one thing. When I grew up in the 40s, 50s, and the talk around the table was always something that has to do with the Second World War, with the establishment of Israel, with great historical events. What's more, the books we read, the films we saw, the songs we sang, they all had to do with history. We were living during a very crucial historical period. So maybe this was that influenced me. But I tell you, when I was 16, I already knew that I'm going to study history, not to be a historian. This was too elevated to think about it. But I knew that I wanted to study history.
Amazing. Thank you. Devin, how about you? Were you that prescient at 16?
Not exactly, but I would say that there are sort of two reasons that led me to study history. First was to try to solve a puzzle, and the second one was really, I would say, out of self-defense. And the puzzle relates to my own family background. My grandfather was born in a city what is now Greece, Salonika, Thessaloniki, but a few years before it had been part of the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, and I knew many of my older relatives who were born in the Ottoman Empire, but they didn't speak Turkish or Greek at home. In fact, they spoke a language that they called Spanish, but that they had written in Hebrew letters, but they had gone to a French school. And there was a picture of my great-grandparents. My great-grandfather was a rabbi, him wearing a fez and everybody wearing Ottoman garb. And this was kind of a puzzle, like how, there weren't many other families in New Jersey that had pictures of people with fezzes on the wall. And it became a kind of a curiosity for me that I wanted to understand and figure out how could that be and where is that world and why don't I see it represented? And when I went to college and I began to try to explore that topic, because in part people would ask me, especially in Jewish spaces, I have to say, your name is Naar. What kind of, that's not a Jewish name. Or if they knew, they say, oh, are you a fool? Because they knew something about Yiddish. And I've even been introduced at a talk when somebody would say, even though his name is Naar, he's not a fool. Like that's a way that I've been introduced before. So actually, I would say kind of confronting some serious walls and obstacles in trying to do my research, and some aggression, I would say, animated me further. I mean, in a sense, looking in the history books, I was in college in the early 2000s. And when I went to the history books, American Jewish history, nothing about Ottoman Jews. Modern Jewish history is European Jewish history. And you could even see footnotes in these books or in these compendiums of sources saying that the Sephardic and Oriental Jews have not yet achieved modernity or modernization, and therefore they will not be included in the books. And, my first feeling, to be honest, was one of shame, to go back to what Professor Feiner had mentioned earlier. And I wanted to, I kind of embraced that. I was very curious. I got a little bit upset about it, and I wanted to see, well, there's got to be a story here. Something is not right. And that led me into a deeper dive into the history. And I had fortunately, some very, very influential advisors, especially in my undergraduate years and in graduate school, that helped open up doors for me and make this kind of process possible. And I would say that those kinds of microaggressions that I encountered early on, we're now pushing 20 years of like a perpetual microaggression in some ways. That also leads me to recognize that some of the problems about what is represented and what is not represented in our narratives of Jewish history are really institutionalized and very deeply embedded. And it's not about individuals, but it's just embedded in our culture.
Structural, as we might say in today's lingo. Let's turn to Maud.
Thanks, David. It's been funny listening. At 16, I think I wanted to sing and dance on Broadway, but something terrible happened en route to Broadway. So actually, my own path, in many ways, was a product of the liberal arts education. I went to Oberlin College, and while I was there, did a study abroad program, and while abroad, met a group of Armenian refugees who I befriended and started to learn about a group of people that I didn't know anything about at all. Talk about a group that I had not encountered in my, I was an English major in college, but insofar as I had taken history courses, didn't exist. And when I went back to Oberlin, I started trying to find them. So I started to take history classes to learn something about Armenian history, and to Russian history and Ottoman history, trying to find them, do research papers. And I got very interested in that topic. And it was through that topic, actually, that it brought me back to Jewish history, because I started to get interested in broad questions of dispersion and genocide and the Middle East and all of these questions. And it seemed that every time I followed something in Armenian history, I found myself back in my own family roots, which were, I'm the daughter of European refugees and on one side of the family. And I hadn't actually done a lot of deep dive into that history, but this examination into the Armenian past took me there. And it was after college, as I tried to figure out how I was going to continue studying this topic, which had really captured my imagination in college, that I started to think, what is the right discipline for getting at this, what started to take shape in my head as comparative diaspora studies was really where I was. You can see I didn't come at this historically, actually. And I just started to get a lot of advice about what would be the right discipline for getting at this intellectual question that I had been chewing at from lots of different directions. And it was through that I ended up at the University of Michigan in a history program. And perhaps we'll talk about, I think later, a bit about the discipline of history. But for me, it really was a disciplining and exercise in sort of learning to think, get my brain to ask the kinds of questions a historian asks about a topic that I had become very interested in, which was this topic of refugees and scattering and peoples that lived in dispersion.
Great, thank you. And Iris.
Thanks. Well, actually, I have to say that I too always wanted to be an historian ever since I was a child, so as far back as I can remember. But I guess a really interesting twist is how I became a Jewish historian, because I'd always thought that I would study what we in Israel rather provincially call general history, which is European history, and pointedly not Jewish history. And in retrospect, it really occurs to me now that I was part of this widening phenomenon of young secular Jews and maybe particularly Jewish women who feel increasingly alienated from Jewish history and from the Jewish past more generally, and feel that it's not really their story to tell. But so I started studying in the Department of General History in Tel Aviv University. I never actually studied Jewish history per se, but I was also very deeply interested in minorities and in notions of identity and difference and you know, the emergence of racial notions, particularly in the early modern period. And I found myself increasingly drawn to Jews, kind of against my better judgment, because he was this one minority that was extremely vocal about its difference, about its alterity, and at the same time wrote back and wrote to marginalize other peoples of its own. And so I became increasingly interested, and I was lucky to find my advisor at Tel Aviv University, Shmuel, who kind of showed me how to combine this kind of burgeoning interest in Jews with my interest in general history. And from there on, I continued to be interested in this kind of tangential position of Jews as both insiders and outsiders in Europe.
And as you use your historian's tools to reconstruct your own professional journey, how pronounced would you say that a kind of existential impulse was in informing you? You began by talking about your interest in women and then minorities, the marginal. How conscious have you been, or how present do you think has been an existential impulse to sort of use history as a way of understanding yourself better?
Do you ask me?
I'm going to start with Iris, and then we're going to work our way back to you, Anita. Since we're going to start with the Iris.
Okay.
You know, I was actually, one of the reasons I never wanted to study Jewish history, and I actually didn't even think of studying Jewish women at any point, or women more generally at any point, was because I've always felt that history is so very different. And that's one of the things I love about it, is the fact that it's not the present, that we have to kind of overcome the present in order to understand the past. And so I was really reluctant to study anything that was so close to myself. I ended up studying Jewish women, kind of inadvertently, I guess. But I really make the effort not to try and avoid historical analogies, and to try not to kind of cast myself into my research, because I think really, you know, the only real thing the past is so different, and we can't really account for the chaotic nature of historical causality. So to me, it's always seemed like the one thing that you can learn from history about the present is really the big lessons, like don't invade Russia in the winter and stuff like that. So I guess I've tried not to be existential about historical studies.
Okay, let's go to you, Anita. What about you, and sort of how present an existential impulse?
I would say that I belong to the generation of historians that was always taught that the only thing people learned from history was that they did not learn from history. And today, what I think, I learned from the present about the past. And this is very interesting. I'll give you an example. It's a far-fetched example, but I think it points to what I want to say. Let's take, for example, the phenomenon of President Trump. Until then, until I followed this phenomenon, I did not understand how come intelligent, educated people could follow a demagogue like Hitler. And suddenly, because of the phenomenon of Trump, I got a feeling that I do understand that not only the mob, but intelligent people, people that learned and are part of the intelligentsia, they follow this man because they see something in his charisma that you and I do not see. And as a result, I thought that the present, I thought about it in the past as well, but this time teaches us about the past. And we can draw conclusions from today about events in the past. And I think this is a more delicate way to relate to the relation between past and present, because I don't believe that we can draw conclusions from the past about the present. The present is so different, but we can learn from the present about phenomena in the past that we did not maybe understand correctly.
Okay, thank you. Maud, I'm just curious, as you described your own path, it seemed like you were using history to work out questions of keen intellectual, but also personal interest. And I'm wondering whether you found adequate answers or where you're at in that journey.
I appreciate the question. I actually really was interested in what you said, Anita, as well. I think I worked on such contemporary history. In fact, my second book was really on the second half of the 20th century, right, butting up on the 21st century. And so I used, in many ways, the tools of the historical discipline and the methodologies and the questions, but to think about a very recent period of time. And so the kind of question of how the past informs the present and vice versa has a different, I think, kind of relationship in my own scholarship than it might in others. I often have people read the work who were alive in the period that I'm writing about, and they have opinions about my interpretations or ways of approaching it. So I think that makes for a somewhat different relationship between past and present than might be true in other work. And I would say I was also trained at a time when we were thinking very heavily about the way we appear in our own scholarship, even when we're studying things that are very far afield. It was very alive in the graduate programs of my time, of the early 90s, when there was a lot of infusion of anthropology and ethnography into the history field and vice versa, particularly at the University of Michigan where I was studying. So that had a very big impact on my intellectual formation and made me think quite a bit about how the personal and the intellectual come together. I think they're very hard to disentangle. So I worked on modern France, for example, which from a contextual standpoint has some things in common with the United States and my own background in life, and some things that are very different. But I think the questions that I brought to the topic were very much shaped by my own place and time. And that's where I think Anita's framing, I find very useful. I don't think I would have put it that way, but I find it very useful, which is to say that every question that a contemporary historian asks about the past is shaped by the present. I think that's something we all know and have learned. And so therefore, almost by definition, my work has been consistently engaged with my own questions about who I am in the world, and not just me personally, but my moment and my structural and intellectual formation, and how that affects the questions I ask about the past and the conclusions I come to and what I see and the assumptions I make. So I think it's very, very much driven by presentist concerns, even if I don't want it to be at times, and even if I'm being careful about that. But I also want to be very clear in acknowledging it when it happens. And I think that makes for a very rich way of opening up new areas of expertise and interventions into a past which otherwise would stay pretty static. So for me, it's been a very powerful way of unlocking new questions.
Right. So now, Devin, we're going to place at your feet a dilemma, because Anita and Maud have both spoken, in a sense, of the inescapability of presentism, and even the advantages of sort of understanding the past through our present day lens, allowing us to see things that we might not otherwise have seen in the past. And yet you've talked about the importance that you intuited at a young age of reclaiming a past, in part so that it could inform the present. So how do you understand the relationship between past and present, between presentism on one hand and a serviceable history on the other?
I mean, I agree with my colleagues insofar as I do believe that the present is we cannot escape the present when we try to enter into the past. And I see those as there's a kind of a dialogue in my work, and I think in the work of historians, sometimes we may not be explicit about it, but I think it's inescapable. And for me in particular, that's the case when I am thinking about when I'm acting in the present. And I'm going into the archives and I'm encountering similar kinds of comments and similar kinds of attitudes and similar kinds of ways of thinking 100 years ago that people in my own, in my own field or in my own academic world are replicating those same patterns of thinking, oftentimes without recognizing that they're doing so. It reminds me, yes, that the past is also very distant and you cannot go back there, but there are very, very strong echoes of that past into the present that inform the kinds of questions that I ask, and also inform how I think about the relationship between the past and the present, and the question of analogy can become very useful here. I mean, not to say that the history repeats itself or anything like that, but I do think that analogies can be useful in making things that seem so strange, make them more familiar. Or make things that seem so familiar, make them strange. So, like, I'm constantly in a position of analogizing, maybe even in a synchronous kind of way. So, like, I am oftentimes asked or commented, "Oh, so Ladino is like a Sephardic Yiddish." That's a kind of analogy. Or a meldar is how you say a cheder in Ladino. And so there's this kind of analogizing that goes in that direction. And in another direction, you can think about, to go back to Professor Shapira's comment about Trump and Hitler. And I kind of think about it the other way, which is you can think about it in terms of what the historical actors thought about those kinds of comparisons. So there's a little bit more work now on what Hitler thought of the United States, and how Hitler thought the United States was kind of a role model, a kind of a model for what Nazi Germany could become in terms of its racial exclusivity and the way in which whites had only rights. And he saw in Mein Kampf, maybe we could create something like that in the United States if we excluded Jews from the rights of citizenship. So there is a kind of analogy that builds on another historical analogy. And I see all of these as tools for trying to understand and make sense out of a past and present that are both in dialogue with each other, but also very difficult to make sense out of without these kinds of tools at our disposal.
Right. So as you have just hinted, and in fact, more than hinted, addressed fully, a question of contemporary relevance is the appropriateness of historical analogies at this current moment. To be sure, the Trump era fostered a whole industry of historical analogizers and their opponents, and particularly revolving around the question of whether the term fascism was applicable to the current moment, whether we saw some of the defining features of fascism from the 1920s and 30s in present-day American political culture. This is a debate that has brought into its midst historians such as Tim Snyder and Sam Moyn, Ruth Ben-Gurion, philosopher Jason Stanley. It's been a really robust debate about the appropriateness of the term fascism. So as a generic matter, I'm wondering what you think, distinguished panelists, about historical analogies. And then if you have anything to say about the particular analogy that has been proposed about fascism then and now. Iris, I know you're an early modernist, but you range widely. So I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are about historical analogies.
Well, I think historical analogies tend to be deceptive, and I think we need to be careful when we use historical analogies. I also don't think that they really convince. I mean, obviously, Trump is one example, but we can also talk about Israel. And Israel is the question of whether or not and to what extent Israel is becoming more and more of a fascist state. It's an extremely interesting question, but it's one that I think, I tend to think that these analogies often obscure more than they reveal. I think that when we talk about fascism, we have to remember that we're talking about a certain historical moment. And when we look at the present, we have to be aware that, yes, of course, there are connections. I mean, the past never really disappears, but even the way that we understand the past today isn't necessarily a reflection of what the past was. It's a reflection of how we represent the past. I think in that sense, I'm in no way, I mean, I do have this kind of historicist position, but I'm not a nihilist. I do think that it's the stories that we tell about the past are incredibly important. They have a profound influence on shaping the present. But we have to be careful, both as historians, in the way that the present shapes our understanding of the past, but we also have to be careful not to use historical analogy too often, because it kind of loses its meaning at some point, and people become kind of dismayed by historical analogy.
So if crassly overused,
Yes.
it can be rendered meaningless. On the other hand, Maud, isn't history a roadmap from the past to the present? And therefore, I mean, I'm thinking of your current position. It's really important to know how Williams College, I think it'd be interesting to know how your predecessor responded in 1918, 1919 to a previous public health crisis.
Yes, and we do look at that. Before I go to that, because I actually think I was heading somewhere else in my head, which is that I've done a lot of comparative historical work. Actually, both of my larger monographs used comparative frameworks in different ways. And one of the things I've thought a lot about is that historians, I'd be curious at the audience, because the audience is probably a diverse group of people made up of historians and non-historians. I think for historians, methodologically speaking, we are just trained to see difference. It's what we're trained to do because we're really interested in context. So, and the deeper and thicker the context, the more particular a thing looks. So if you hold up two things next to each other as a historian, you're almost inevitably going to focus on the difference. Other disciplines focus more on theoretical similarities. And we can be forced to think about that, but it's not where we go naturally. Whereas the lay, I think, interaction with history is to see a lot of parallels and similarities across time. So they coexist with each other. Actually, I think both of those things are true. But I think for historians, it is harder to do that kind of simple analogizing to pick up on the prior point. Having said that, the way you framed the question, David, and so I am currently not serving really as an active historian, although I do believe I loved your starting question, because I actually think we wear these identities much like other identities. I'm always going to be a historian. I think like a historian. But it is true that in my current role as a president of an academic institution, I think about the past all the time as a way of thinking about where we came from. And in fact, I'm currently, a lot of us in institutions like this are thinking a lot about, are we trapped by our history? Because our histories actually are often quite exclusive. We're quite exclusionary, right? These institutions were formed for a certain group of people at a certain time and a certain moment. And we are trying very hard to take the legacy that's good out of that, but to evolve, to be much more inclusive and diverse, of course, to change our educational missions and what we're trying to reach. So we're indebted to that history. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for all the people that came before us and the things they were committed to and believed in. But we also have to move out of that. And in fact, if we double down on what's the same, we're going to have a hard time, in fact, making the tremendous changes we have to make in order to be serviceable institutions in the 21st century. So that's a little bit different, right? And I think it gets to the instrumentalization of history and how it can be useful as you think about moving forward in time.
Do you have any thoughts about what's, yeah, go ahead, Anita, please.
I have my doubts about the usefulness of analogies, because then history never repeats itself, and it's always different, and the identity of people is different, and even the language is different. Even when they use the same terms, they don't talk about the same thing. So analogies are something to be used very, very seldom. And even then, I would be doubtful about their usefulness. Sometimes we like to use them as terms of reference, as shortcuts to describing something. But history, as Maud said very truthfully, history always looks for the difference, not for the repeated phenomena. So please be careful with analogies.
So if history doesn't tell us much about the present, or at least if we should be wary of analogizing, of learning from the past to inform us about the present. Anita, how would you articulate the value of history? Why is history important?
Who said that history has got a value? Why should it have a value? I love learning history. I love reading books on history to this very day. And I don't think that I am looking for any value. The same way as you read literature, the same way that you study philosophy. What usefulness is there? I think people from the beginning of history were asking questions about their past. And we are part of the long human history. And I don't think that history should be useful. History is an aesthetic, part of our aesthetic culture. And as such, it should not be, we should not be looking for its usefulness. We love it, we learn it, we convey it. But what about usefulness? Why should it be useful? In what way is it useful? And what's more, I have my doubts.
Jump in, Anita, because while I think we agree on the fundamentals of the concerns of analogizing and context, I do actually think it has a utility. And I think maybe it's that word itself that we're debating, because I do think understanding where you are involves understanding where you came from. And so it's the utility. So where I'm thinking of it is really the question David was asking me. I think a lot about it in institutional history, because I have a lot of people just in the current moment asking, for example, that my institution grapple with a history that they're not so comfortable with, or certain aspects of the history they're not so comfortable with. And so then part of it is sort of, how did we get to be who we are? What were our blind spots? To go back to when we were talking about Ottoman Jewish history, what did we leave out when we were telling the story of who we were in the past? And what did those blind spots actually lead to real political consequences in the future? It's not just that it was left out and we'll shrug, but actually in the telling a story a certain way, it actually had real-time consequences in the present for decisions that were made and the ways in which we think and understand ourselves and choices we make about the future. So I actually think it has, I think it does have a utility in the present. I'm just not sure that the analogizing is the way, the lessons, and it's more the origin story and who we want to be in relation to our past and going forward.
If I may comment on this, I have my doubts how much historians can influence present day world. The fact is that every young guy who writes in Facebook is has more impact than all of us, all our books, whatever we did. And this fact should be treated. This is why historians should learn a bit of humility. We are not the most important people in the world, and we are not going to change the world with our study. We can understand better ourselves, yes, but the world, changing the world, I'm not sure that we are the ones who would make the difference.
Well, I must say I appreciate that call for epistemological modesty. It's always welcome amongst academics and perhaps not sufficiently practiced. But, I mean, Anita, you're a student of nationalism. You know how many historians have played a prominent role in the history of just European nationalism. Michelet, Droysen, Ranke, Palaci, Masaryk, Dinur. Historians have been central, and history has been central to the project as well. So we might condemn that. We might say that's a kind of inappropriate instrumentalization of history, but it certainly has been central to a number of the most powerful movements,
but what about
many
today?
of which you've studied.
But today nobody cares about historians. It's not by chance that today's historians in Israel, for instance, are of no consequence in the political arena, in the arena where things happen. And this brings us back to the crisis of humanities. It's not only historians that are with a value that goes down all the time. What can I say?
Well, I think we need to historicize that, because I suspect that historians have been lamenting their impetus for many, many years, for decades, even centuries. Iris, the value of history. You've suggested the danger of analogizing. How do you imagine the value of history, the worth of the?
You know, to some extent, I do agree with Anita that we don't need to constantly be justifying our utility. I mean, there's this kind of neoliberal logic that is a losing game for us, and I'm glad that we all agree that we don't have to play by those rules. But I do think that I disagree with the notion that history has no utility, or that it's of little influence today. I think just the fact, if you look at Poland, for instance, today, and the fact that historians in Poland are being put on trial for discussing Poland's complicity in the Holocaust, shows us just how deeply historians can influence society and how fearful states can be of that influence. And I think it's no coincidence that places like Poland often persecute historians. I mean, we do have a role in shaping the present, because the stories we tell are incredibly influential. If you look at projects like and it's not just modern history. Obviously, the Holocaust comes to mind as like the immediate example of that. But if you look at something like the 1619 Project in the US, in US history, you can see how deeply relevant 17th century can still be, or our perception of 17th century history can still be, to shaping contemporary politics, to shaping education. If we talk about schools and you know how history is taught today. If we look at the Nakba and commemoration of the Nakba, the problem of commemorating the Nakba in Israel is that there are laws against that. So yes, I think states are concerned that history matters and it matters deeply. And I think that they are right to be concerned. I do think that we have an influence, and I think that we have to be mindful of that when we write our histories and when we produce these narratives that are both shaped by the present and continue to shape the present.
I mean, you've just made a compelling case for the relevance of history, notwithstanding your opening expressions of support for Anita's position. So I wonder if you could say more about that, because it's not just that states recognize the relevance of history and seek to suppress revisionist accounts that challenge an official narrative. By invoking the 1619 Project, you're suggesting that history can be absolutely essential in opening up perspectives in a constructive way as well. So where do you sit on this?
Well, no, I think I agree with Maud that we have to define what utility means. I think what we're seeing in the crisis of the humanities and particularly in the crisis of the historical discipline, we're seeing students asking, well, what can we do with this? And I agree with Anita, we can't do much. I mean, we can't plan contemporary politics by looking at the past. And that's part of the problem, is that we've become disillusioned with the political utility of history in the narrow sense of kind of being able to harness historical knowledge into planning, strategies and tactics and so on and so forth. But I do think that we need to be aware of the fact that history offers a different kind of utility, which is particularly humanist in nature. It allows us to challenge, narratives of national glorification. It allows us to think of essentialisms in more critical ways. So I think it's clear that history it has a deeply political value, it has a deeply contemporary value, but it doesn't necessarily have the same kind of value that has been ascribed to it in the past.
Yeah. Okay. Devin, I want to turn to you and ask, what do you see as a particular task or challenge of Jewish history in particular, if any? Or would you simply sort of lump it together with other dimensions and elements and aspects of the discipline of history? Is there something specific about Jewish history that I guess speaks to you and your sense of vocation?
Well, I would say I'd like to maybe just answer a little bit the question of history first, which is, I do agree that there is a very strong aesthetic element to it. I mean, I feel like it's a creative process. I feel like I have been able to channel my father, who's a fine artist, a painter, and my mother, who's a lawyer, bring those together. And, there are some elements of that I find in my own work. But I do think that history in general, and Jewish history in particular, is really about power. And I think that it is about power, and it is about representation, and it is about which stories get told by whom and how, and which stories do not get told. And so I think in that regard, history in general has a very potent utility in the present. I mean, it can inform, as Iris was mentioning, all of these contemporary kinds of conversations, although with many different caveats to keep that in mind. And I think that if we imagine that we are somehow disconnected from either the past or the present, or that this element of power in the present is not really relevant, I think we abdicate a certain kind of public responsibility, because then it's not like history or the past will not be debated or adjudicated on the public square. It will be, we just might not be present for it. And therefore we give up all of our expertise and all of the time that we've dedicated to really delving into our past, and let the Facebookers of the world decide what is the nature what is the answer to any given historical question. So I think that this would be a call on my part to get more engaged, for historians to take a public position, or to at least participate in public conversations about history. It goes back to what Noam was saying about, the message and part of the mission of organizations like the AJS are to be contributing to kinds of public conversations. And I think that that's something that historians can do. And I think that's especially the case in, as it relates to a Jewish historian. But I would frame it a little bit differently. I would say we shouldn't be talking about Jewish historians. I think we should talking about historians of Jews, because we might be Jewish or we might not be Jewish. But in terms of studying Jewish history, I think what we can do as people who study Jewish history is that we need to be historians of Jews. And what I mean by that is not just, as is often the case in the United States, historians of Ashkenazi Jews or historians of European Jews or historians of white Jews, who oftentimes masquerade as historians of Jews, but they really take one sliver of the Jewish experience and hold that up as representative of the whole. And I think in this regard, that can become one of the current challenges and tasks of a historian of the Jews. And it's not just about inclusion. I think that people think it's okay, great, I have one footnote about Mizrahi Jews, or I have one paragraph about Jews of color, or I have one 7 minutes I dedicated into one lecture about Jews of color. I think that the inclusion narrative is missing the point, because what actually needs to happen is we need to think about, once you take into account a fuller range of Jewish experiences, how the central questions of the discipline might change. And some of us on this panel are already involved in that. Questions of race, questions of colonialism, questions of gender, questions of migration. Those key questions, we can begin to develop new answers for Jewish history more broadly, once we are able to imagine the vastness of Jewish history and begin to take in some of those other kind of perspectives. And in the process, maybe we need to destabilize some of the basic terms with which we develop our conversations about history. Arabs and Jews. Okay, well, what about the figure of the Arab Jew? And how does that maybe call on us to rethink some of our categories? Black-Jewish relations. Well, what about Black Jews? And how does that make that conversation break down before it even begins? And so these are some of the questions that I'm interested in, some of the things that I think we as historians of Jews can offer, both for the better understanding of the past and also thinking about its current application today on the public square.
Right, but clearly not everybody can be an historian of the entirety of the Jewish experience, of every slice of Jewish life. That's unrealistic. And it's not, in some sense, desirable, because people will not have the languages and contextual nuance to do that well. So let's home in a little bit and tell me, what does the agenda look like? Where are we at in sort of the narrative arc of the discipline in terms of pushing past not just inclusion, but the reframing of a new set of questions? And I guess I'd like to, explicitly ask, given that you've spoken of power dynamics as so central to the discipline and the importance of the public role of the historian, do you imagine that kind of history that you're talking about as political?
Well, there are a couple of different, very big questions there. I would say that in terms of thinking about where we are as a discipline, I'm not trying to say that everybody has to become an expert in everything. That's completely not possible, nor is it desirable. But I think in terms of the framing of the discussion, to be open to actually our own, to be a little bit more maybe humble about it, and to say that maybe we need to identify, when we're talking about European Ashkenazi Jews, maybe we should say we're talking about European Ashkenazi Jews and we're not talking about the Jews. And I think that that can be a start, because, we operate in a world in which there are certain kinds of categories or communities that are marked and others are unmarked. And there's kind of privilege that goes with being unmarked. When you're, if you're a white Ashkenazi Jew, you get to be called a Jew, and you don't need any other adjectives to describe you. But when you're a Sephardic Jew or a Mizrahi Jew or Jew of color, there's sort of other kinds of adjectives that need to be attached to you in order for legibility to emerge. And so what I would call for would be a first step in attuning ourselves to those kinds of processes and recognizing that at least there are multiplicities, and we cannot necessarily hold up one group as representative of the whole. Certainly not if we want to be able to make room for other kinds of experiences. And I would say in that regard that those very manipulation of those categories, that's a political process insofar as it's not necessarily partisan. There may be partisan implications or policy implications, but it is political insofar it is a conversation about power and representation. And I think that we need to be more aware of that as a discipline, more aware of the role that we play in exerting power, in opening up conversations, delimiting conversations, and excluding participation of other possible interlocutors from those conversations.
Anita, you wanted to jump in.
Oh, I wondered when you mentioned the vast spaces of history that every historian should take into account. At the end of the day, we always focus on a small piece of reality, and we do not describe the vast spaces of the whole civilization of Jews. Actually, what you described was something that sociologists do, not historians. Historians try to focus on that piece of reality that they can understand and that they can cope with. So I am all for an inclusion of having all sorts of Jews, all sorts of cultures included in Jewish history. But it depends very much about the historians themselves. If there are many historians like you, the Sephardi history would get a better representation. I, who came from Poland, I am more interested naturally in the history of Poland. On the other hand, I had a doctoral student that her parents came from Iraq, but she was interested in something to do with Polish Jewry, and she studied Yiddish. So maybe the same way, maybe there are Polish Jews who study Ladino these days, maybe, and in a way we can have the whole plethora of Jewish cultures represented if the historians find interest in the topic.
Could I just briefly respond to that, which is, I think that those choices are not innocent choices. They're predicated on our own positionality, our own power, our own access to power. And so when we choose to reinforce dominant narratives, that's a political act. It's not innocent, and it's not just an aesthetic project in my mind. Those are really have really deep ramifications. And so it's not just like I felt because it was fun that I would like to study Sephardic Jews. I felt like I wanted to study Sephardic Jews because they had been excluded from the story by, among some of the most prominent figures in our field, who, if we take your logic, for example, a very personal, circumscribed, narrow framework. I'm only going to study things that are relevant to me or to my world. I think that is not the approach to take in terms of understanding history. And, I'm learning, I also am delving into Yiddish sources myself, because I think that I'm not looking for it's not about inclusion, it's about the bigger questions. Like, how can you understand the history of Israel if you do not understand that half of the population comes from the Muslim world? And their story is not really part of the study of Jewish history, as far as I'm aware, certainly not in the United States, and it's not really represented in Israel. And I think that impedes our historical understanding, and it impoverishes the narratives that we tell ourselves.
Okay, I must tell you that in Israel, the younger generation is very much interested in Sephardi history, and there are groups that focus on it. So don't feel neglected as you describe it.
Well, this has been a very interesting exchange. Iris, did you want to jump in? Yeah, go ahead.
Could I just, I just wanted to respond to that because I really agree with Devin. I think that we need to take into account that there is no one Jewish history. And that I think the major challenge of the discipline has always been, and is now with more urgency, the question of how to bring into dialogue disparate Jewish communities, how to bring into dialogue both the history of Jews in Poland and the history of Jews in North Africa and in Asia without essentializing Jewishness. And on the other hand, we also want to be able to study Jews and non-Jews in tandem, so to bring Jewish history into dialogue with non-Jewish history. And there's kind of a tension between these two poles. And where our choices in this matter will always be political. I mean, if we choose to look only at Jews and not at Jews in Poland, or if a Polish historian looks at Poland in the 17th century and doesn't look at Jews, that is a very deeply political choice. And I think one of the things that we could do today that we haven't been able to do in the past is to conduct collaborative research. And I'm a strong believer in that. I think that today we have the opportunity to work together, scholars of Ladino, scholars of Yiddish, scholars of Judeo-Arabic, and so on and so forth, through collaborative projects. And I think that's where we might, this urge to bring Jewish history and to make it more inclusive, that's where it's going to take us, I hope.
And would you articulate as such that your work is political in that sense? I mean, you've called attention to the politics of history. Yes. Does that lead you to conclude that your work is in that sense political, in that it is inclusive and collaborative and seeks to erase boundaries that had been established in previous historiographical generations?
Absolutely. I would say that any kind of historical work is deeply political. I mean, if you choose not to be inclusive, that's also a form of politics, not necessarily the one that I would subscribe to, but it is political. I think that, so to me, looking at Jewish history as part of general history has been a deeply political choice. Studying Jewish women in the early modern period has been political. My work on translation now, any choice that I make as an historian, I'm constantly making political choices, which is why I think that history is a deeply political vocation, not just in how it shapes the present, but also in how it's shaped by our own political affiliations and beliefs.
How do you see it, Maud? And I should add that your work has been extraordinarily comparative. You have sort of consciously sought to collapse boundaries, hermetic boundaries that consign this group or that to its own world. Is that a political act? And how do you think of the politics of this?
Sure. I actually think this maybe refers back to something I was saying earlier, that insofar as our current moment shapes the questions we ask of the past, I think this panel, this most immediate exchange is a demonstration of that. Sort of the questions we're asking of the past, who we consider to be the center of modern Jewish history, however that's defined, and how we understand those boundaries is shaped by the present. It's shaped by the political questions of the present, because our disciplines are entrenched in the moments in which we live. So the fact that we're even using the word inclusivity, I find fascinating. I've been working in this field for longer than some people on this panel, not as long as of others, but we would have never used that word. I use that word every day right now in my current job, but I would have never used it to describe what in fact was a project, now that I think about it, of thinking about broadening the boundaries of sort of who was in and who was out of the narrative. I don't think I went as far in my work as one could go in that regard. And I think we've seen some examples here where we're continuing to expand the boundaries. But the very fact that we're even thinking this way, I think is, yes, very much a reflection of contemporary historical work focus on matters of identity in 21st century America. Actually, it's funny when—
Not only in America.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And Idris, when you were talking about examples of modern political projects that are informed by history, I was thinking of the debates that are going on right now in France around, the importation of American post-colonial, I'm putting it all in quotes, and categories of race in France, and the way in which the political election is starting to divide around questions of what is the right national intellectual project for thinking about and studying the past. And these are some of these topics that we're talking about are very much drawn from our own. By our own, I mean this context. I'm sitting in a higher ed institution in the United States where every field, including Jewish history, is increasingly becoming wrapped up in these questions in the way in my era they were wrapped up in these questions of ethnography and et cetera. We can be bounded by our times and place. It's really quite fascinating for me. And this kind of goes back to the aesthetics of history. It's what is so exciting about the work we do, because if there was just one story to tell, we would have told it a long time ago and we'd all be out of work. But it's in fact this constant reimagining of who our story is about, what the key and important questions are that keep being reshaped and keep taking us back into the archives to look again to see what we missed the last round and what, how that shaped the story differently. So I find it very exciting.
Anita, I want to go back to you, if I may, Anita, and sort of test a proposition as against your earlier point. We live in a world in which, in a political culture in which lies and fake news are ubiquitous. Does history have any role to play in countering, deflating, correcting that political culture?
I wish I believed that we are capable of doing it. I do think that the core of history is integrity, no doubt about it. And the wish to get to the core of things, to understand things, to know things as they were. Can we confront fake news? I don't believe we can. I think that people, let's think for a second about historical memory. Let's take, for example, the question of the Nakba. You know how many times historians confronted this question in Israel? And then if you ask somebody on the street, people are not aware of it. How come they are not aware of it? The same way that in Poland, they are not aware of being a perpetrator together with being victims. The same way that in France, they think that all the French were in the resistance. So people remember what they wish to remember. And this is one of the limits of our capability to shape the historical reality, because people give to the historian just a fraction of the political field. And this field is influenced by television, by film, by whatever you read, whatever you see. And the historians are just a small group of not very important people that try to impact reality. Sorry, but this is my pessimistic view.
Yes, it's a realist stance that verges on fatalism. And I want to come back to Iris to ask about this, because what Anita has pointed to, I mean, I think she's doubted throughout the utility of history in that kind of instrumentalized way, but all the more so in the age of social media, where you see a tremendous fragmentation and segmentation of the media market, and for that matter, of knowledge itself. in light of that, I'm curious, when you face the specter of lies and fake news, is it possible for history to play a role, or is that simply hermeneutically, impossible?
Well, I think I think the pessimism isn't unwarranted, but I think history hasn't been better off in the past for much of history. I mean, women have been excluded from history and from the role of being historians for most of history. So if we're looking at Jewish history, then as Devin pointed out, it's been dominated by Ashkenazi Jews and by white Jews. And I think these things, actually what I'm saying, I mean, if there is any cause for optimism, is that these things are slowly changing within both the discipline of Jewish history and other histories. So I think there is some kind of positive change. I agree that it's limited and that we have to be mindful of the fact that our impact on society is limited. But I think that we can't afford to think of ourselves as having no impact. I think we have a huge impact. I think if we take the example of a book about the blood libel, for instance, I'm not talking about Moderator, of course, but Ariel Toaf's book on the blood libel, which was picked up by right-wing organizations. Any story we tell has some kind of political potential and can be picked up at any given moment. We're not always responsible for the political uses. I wrote a book on Jews and race and notions of race among Jews, which could be and has been picked up for needs that I don't necessarily condone. But we do have to be aware of the fact that what we choose to study matters and that it can be utilized in political ways. And I also think that we have to be mindful of the fact that we teach the teachers and that children who go to school will receive a certain education, that we impact in indirect ways, but we do impact that education. I think that's another kind of route of influence that we have and that we have to be mindful of.
David, can I say something on this question? Because there's I also want, I mean, I'm maybe getting away a little bit from the framework of optimism and pessimism, and just note something, Iris, you said at the beginning, which is, I think there's a built-in assumption in the question around fake news that somehow in the past, people had better access to better information and that historians played a bigger role in telling the truth about it. I actually think you could spin the current moment as the moment where historians have had the biggest impact, because at least we have access to social media and we're one of the voices out there telling the truth, whatever that truth may be, where, if you even think about some of the great historical figures that you mentioned, David, who had a very particular version of history they were telling and a few people who were reading it, and it had a huge impact on nationalism. But, what did most people know or think or believe, or what were they able to question? So I would just give a slightly different spin to the era we're in and our impact within it. I think it's probably never been greater, which is not to say it's any more effective or important than Anita suggests. We have to remain humble about our impact, but nevertheless.
Interesting perspective. The exact opposite, the diminished perspective with social media, the voice is amplified. I want to now ask a final question as we move towards conclusion of what has been a really stimulating panel, for which I thank you and will thank you again. But I'll begin with Devin and ask, what historian or historians do you regard as models, or from whom do you draw inspiration in going about your work?
Great, thank you. I mean, I think that, well, it's interesting. The figure that I was thinking of, it's really sort of a coterie of figures from 100 years ago who I see as, I kind of have a dual, in terms of my training. I come out of a school that goes back to through my advisor back to Salo Baron and like that, and that's sort of like one thread that I think about. But I also have another thread that I find inspiring to me, which have been the Ottoman Jewish historians themselves from 100 years ago, who I found to be very interesting in terms of already 100 years ago trying to insert into the argument, because I think they realized that history was not, they couldn't necessarily capture history as it really was. And I think they saw history as a battlefield of argumentation. and trying to bring evidence and perspectives that can be compelling. And there was one guy I like, Isaac Cohen from Salonika in 1913, and he wrote reflecting on the absence of that story in the histories of Heinrich Gretz and others of his contemporaries, saying that they say that we, the Jews of the Orient, are a family of mutes, a group of people without language or literature. We add to this double negation yet a third: we have no history. And he was writing actually a history of Jewish women in the Orient in Judeo-Spanish at the time. And I find inspiration in those words because I still feel like I'm fighting that fight in some ways. But it's not only, again, to bring that story just to say, here's this piece and then there's another piece. But I do think, as Iris and some others were mentioning, that there's a way in which bringing these different narrative threads together can be very enriching and can open up new pathways of investigation and research. And so I hope that, thinking about those kinds of Ottoman Jewish historians who I think about on a kind of a regular basis, thinking about what they were trying to do and open up the conversation even further, that's something that I'd like to see that I might be able to achieve with my own work.
Right. I mean, on one hand, plus ça change, right? Nothing's changed in 100 years. And then on the other hand, you have an endowed chair in Sephardic studies at a first-rate public university. So things have changed. Whether we call it, a progress in some unadulterated sense is a different question. But there clearly is movement and an expansion of the field, of which you are, I think, a prime example. Iris, whom have you drawn inspiration from as in thinking of yourself as an historian?
Well, I think I've been inspired primarily by historians who challenge disciplinary divides, primarily between Jewish and non-Jewish history, but also between history, literature, and anthropology. I think we as historians, because we deal with text and because we work on culture, we have so much to learn from literature and from anthropology. So I would probably mention Stephen Greenblatt as an influence and new historicism and in ways of combining literature, literary studies, and history. I've also been deeply inspired by historians who try to, as we discussed earlier, kind of rethink historical agency in more inclusive ways. So historians of gender, obviously Joan Wallace-Scott comes to mind, historians who try to think differently about modernity, about early modernity, Divish Chakrabarty and others. But I have to admit that recently I've become more and more interested in the works of the Wissenschaft des Judentums, which is to me kind of a revelation because I've always been in no way a positivist, but because I'm working on translation now and creating this database of translation with a group of very talented young researchers, I've become increasingly interested in Steinschneider's work and just seeing the massive scale of his knowledge and his abilities. We are a group of 7 researchers and we still haven't reached that scale of knowledge and to be able to map Jewish literature in that way. So I would somewhat surprisingly mention Steinschneider as a model historian in my current project.
Yeah, bibliographic erudition of that scale we will not see in a long time.
Yeah.
Maud.
It's funny. I actually had scribbled down Joan Scott on my list, which is funny because it's, when I think about the impact of Joan's work, actually 2 different works on my own scholarship over time, it goes back a long time to big questions of thinking about sort of who's in and who's outside of history and how do we think about that. I think that was hugely formative back in the day. And I'm fascinated that more than one of us still sort of think back to that moment as a way of shaping our entire intellectual trajectory. The social historians that trained me, Todd Endelman, my own advisor, but also Paula Hyman and other of that generation also had a very big impact on me in thinking about sort of everyday Jews in my own work. And then for me, the other really big recent influence was absolutely post-colonial scholarship. I wouldn't so much call one name into the conversation here as to say the entire shift to thinking outside the boundaries of the nation state in Europe and to thinking about the impact of the colonial and then post-colonial world on shaping history was seismic in not only the way I studied history, but the way I taught it and thought about it. And so that's been a very significant influence.
Great. And last but not least, Anita.
To tell you the truth, I feel very old-fashioned in this group. Maybe I am too old to incorporate these new trends, which my students have incorporated. Cultural history I also do, but feminist history, questions of Sephardi history, etc., etc. I was influenced at the beginning by Jacob Katz and Talmon. And Talmon I wanted to mention because Talmon was not only a historian, even though some people tell me he's not an historian, he's an intellectual, a committed intellectual, that's all. But he combined a broad vision of history together with a strong commitment to everyday politics. He was involved in Israeli politics before 67 and after 67 to his last day. And this kind of historians that see as their duty to impact political life in Israel, we do not see today. We do not see this kind. And in a way, when I thought about this panel, I felt the absence of this broad cultural impact on history of these people. They are not there anymore.
They're not there, but they make clear that, say, for example, understanding the origins of totalitarian democracy as an historical matter can be of relevance to today. So this, in a certain sense, opens up the whole question with which you began, Anita. I want to thank all of the panelists, Anita Shapira, Devin, Naar, Mandel, Idelson-Shein, for a really stimulating hour and a half. Thank you to the audience for your attention, for your questions, which alas we did not get to because we were so engaged in our own conversation. But I welcome you all to join next week again, same time in the respective time zones for a conversation on the same subject in Hebrew to be moderated by Shmuel Feiner. Thanks to the staff of the UCLA Leve Center for Jewish Studies, to the AJS, and to the Historical Society of Israel. Goodbye, be well, and stay safe.